January 26, 1945, 2 p.m., near Holtzwihr, Alsace, France. The snow fell in thick, silent curtains across the rolling hills of Alsace, each flake catching what little light filtered through the pewter sky. The temperature hovered just below freezing, turning the breath of 40 American soldiers into ghostly wisps that dissipated quickly in the bitter air. Second Lieutenant Audie Murphy crouched in a shallow foxhole at the edge of a snow-covered clearing, his gloved fingers wrapped around the cold metal of his field telephone. At 19, he stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, but his eyes held the weight of 2 years of continuous combat across North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and now France. Behind him, the Vosges Mountains rose like ancient sentinels. Their peaks, shrouded in mist and memory, dot the forest around Holtzwihr, whispered with an ominous quiet that every combat veteran recognized the silence that precedes the storm. Murphy's Company B, 15th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division had advanced through these woods the night before, their boots crunching through 6 inches of fresh snow as they pushed deeper into German-held territory. Now they held a precarious salient, a finger of American presence thrust into the heart of enemy lines, vulnerable and exposed. The smell of pine mixed with cordite hung in the air, a scent that had become as familiar to Murphy as his own skin dot to his right. An M10 tank destroyer squatted like a mechanical beast among the trees, its 3-inch gun pointed toward the German positions beyond the clearing. The crewmen whose names Murphy had learned over shared K-rations and whispered conversations in the pre-dawn. Darkness moved with the practiced efficiency of soldiers who had survived this long by trusting each other completely. The tank destroyer's armor gleamed dully in the pale light, its olive drab paint scarred by dozens of battles, each mark a testament to American industrial might and the men who wielded it. Murphy lifted the field telephone receiver to his ear, the static crackling like a winter fire. Through the interference, he could hear the voice of the artillery observer miles behind the lines, safe in his bunker with hot coffee and dry socks. But safety was a luxury that Murphy and his men could not afford. They were the tip of the spear, the thin line that held back the darkness. And in the distance, through the falling snow, came the low rumble that every infantry soldier dreaded, the mechanical growl of approaching German armor. The sound began as a distant vibration, felt more than heard, transmitted through the frozen ground into the bones of men who had learned to read the earth's whispers of approaching death. Then came the sharper notes, the clank and rattle of tank tracks, the whine of engines under strain, the metallic voice of a German commander shouting orders that were lost in the wind, but clear in their intent. Murphy raised his field glasses, the lenses fogging momentarily before clearing to reveal a sight that would have broken lesser men. 6 German tanks emerging from the tree line 800 yards away, their long guns seeking targets, followed by waves of gray-clad infantry that seemed to flow across the snow like a deadly tide dot. This was not supposed to happen. The intelligence reports had been clear. German forces in this sector were demoralized, depleted, barely capable of mounting effective resistance. But intelligence reports were written by men who slept in beds and ate hot meals, not by soldiers who had learned that the enemy's capacity for violence was as limitless as human desperation. These were not the shattered remnants of a defeated army. These were veterans of the Wehrmacht's 6th SS Mountain Division, Nord, hardened fighters who had battled across the frozen wastes of Finland and the burning sands of North Africa. They came now with the fury of men who had nothing left to lose, their eyes bright with the terrible mathematics of war: kill or be killed. Advance or die. The German attack was part of Operation Nordwind, Hitler's last desperate gambit in the West, launched in the final weeks of December 1944 to relieve pressure on the collapsing Ardennes offensive. While the world's attention focused on the Battle of the Bulge, German Army Group G had gathered its remaining reserves for one final push in Alsace. hoping to recapture Strasbourg and trap the French First Army. The operation bore all the hallmarks of Nazi strategy in those dying days, ambitious beyond reason, fueled by ideology rather than logistics, and utterly indifferent to the human cost. Murphy had seen it all before. From the beaches of Sicily to the mountains of Italy, from the forests of the Vosges to this frozen clearing in Alsace, he had watched German soldiers fight with a ferocity that seemed to transcend rational military doctrine. They fought as if the very act of combat could somehow reverse the tide of history, as if their willingness to die could somehow resurrect the thousand-year Reich from its rapidly approaching grave. But Murphy had also learned something that German high command seemed incapable of grasping, that courage alone could not overcome the fundamental arithmetic of modern warfare. Numbers mattered. Logistics mattered. And most of all, the industrial capacity of a nation that could produce rations by the millions mattered. The ration had become, in Murphy's mind, the perfect symbol of American abundance. Each rectangular cardboard box contained more calories than many German soldiers saw in 3 days' canned meat. Crackers, chocolate, cigarettes, and matches, all packaged with an efficiency that spoke to the vast machinery of American production. Murphy had once calculated that the United States produced more rations in a single day than Germany manufactured in a week. It was a small thing, perhaps, but it represented something larger. A nation that could feed its soldiers properly was a nation that could sustain a war indefinitely. German soldiers, by contrast, survived on increasingly meager rations. Their bread was adulterated with sawdust and potato flour. Their meat was often horse meat when it existed at all, and their ersatz coffee bore no resemblance to the genuine article that filled American canteens. Murphy had interrogated enough German prisoners to know that they fought as much for American rations as for ideology. The promise of a full belly was often more motivating than any speech about Aryan supremacy or Lebensraum. But hunger, Murphy had learned, could make men desperate. And desperate men were the most dangerous of all. The German attack began with a thunderous artillery barrage that shook the earth and sent snow cascading from the pine branches like premature avalanches. Murphy pressed himself deeper into his foxhole as shells screamed overhead, their explosions sending geysers of frozen earth and splintered wood into the air. The sound was indescribable, a roar that seemed to come from the throat of some primordial beast. A violence so absolute that it transcended mere noise and became a physical force that hammered at the chest and sculled out through the chaos. Murphy could hear his men calling out positions, confirming readiness, preparing for the assault they all knew was coming. These were veterans now, men who had survived the crucible of combat through Sicily, Salerno, Anzio, and southern France. They moved with the fluid grace of dancers who had long since learned the steps of this deadly ballet. But even veterans could be overwhelmed, and Murphy could see in their eyes the recognition that this attack was different, larger, more determined, more desperate than anything they had faced in months. The German infantry came forward in rushes, using the natural cover of trees and snow-filled gullies with the skill born of years of combat experience. These were not the teenage conscripts and old men who had filled German ranks in the final months of the war. These were professional soldiers, men who understood that their survival depended on their ability to close with the enemy quickly and decisively. They moved in small groups, covering each other's advance with disciplined fire, their white winter camouflage making them nearly invisible against the snow until they were almost within grenade range. Murphy watched them come with the cold calculation of a predator studying its prey. He had killed more men than he cared to count. Estimates ranged as high as 240 over the course of his combat service, but he had never grown comfortable with the act. Each death weighed on him. Each enemy soldier who fell to his rifle or called an artillery fire represented someone's son, brother, father. But Murphy had long since learned to compartmentalize such thoughts. Sentiment was a luxury that could get him and his men killed. And his first responsibility was to the soldiers who depended on him, to make the hard decisions that would bring them home alive. The M10 tank destroyer to his right opened fire, its 3-inch gun sending a high-velocity shell screaming toward the approaching German armor. The round struck the leading Panzer IV with a sound like a giant bell being struck by a sledgehammer. But the tank continued forward, smoke pouring from its engine compartment, but its main gun still tracking targets. German tanks in early 1945 were not the mechanical marvels they had been in 1941, but they were still deadly. Their crews experienced, and their armor thick enough to deflect all but the most precisely placed shots. Murphy keyed his radio and called for artillery support, his voice calm and professional despite the chaos erupting around him. The forward observer's voice crackled back through the static, confirming coordinates, requesting adjustments, promising fire. Support that might arrive in minutes that felt like hours. In the distance, Murphy could hear the flat crack of German rifles, the stutter of machine guns, the sharp reports of Panzerfausts being fired at American positions. The battle was joined now, and there could be no withdrawal. No quarter asked or given. The first German shell struck the M10 tank destroyer with devastating effect. Murphy felt the concussion as a physical blow, the shock wave slamming him against the walls of his foxhole with enough force to drive the breath from his lungs. When he looked up, the tank destroyer was wreathed in flames, black smoke pouring from its open hatches. The crew bailed out with practiced efficiency, but Murphy could see that one man, the gunner, a kid from Ohio whose name was Patterson, was not moving. He lay crumpled beside the burning vehicle, his body twisted at an angle that spoke of terrible injury. It was then that Murphy made the decision that would define not only his own legend, but the very meaning of American courage in the face of overwhelming odds. While his men fell back to prepared positions in the woods as ordered, while the German attack gained momentum with each passing minute, while every tactical manual ever written demanded that he withdraw and consolidate his forces, Murphy did something that defied all military logic. He advanced. The burning M10 tank destroyer sat in the middle of the clearing like a funeral pyre, its armor glowing cherry red in some places, flames licking from every opening. The vehicle's ammunition could cook off at any moment, turning the tank destroyer into a massive bomb that would kill anyone within 50 yards. But the M10 also mounted a .50 caliber machine gun, and that machine gun commanded the entire approach route the German infantry had to use to reach Murphy's company. Murphy sprinted across the open ground between his foxhole and the burning tank destroyer, his boots slipping on the snow-covered earth, German rifle bullets snapping past his head like angry wasps. The distance could not have been more than 30 yards, but it felt like 30 miles as he dodged and weaved, expecting at any moment to feel the crushing impact of a rifle bullet or the devastating blast of a tank shell. Behind him, he could hear his men shouting, some calling him back, others providing covering fire, all of them understanding that their lieutenant had just crossed the line between courage and madness. Murphy clambered onto the burning tank destroyer and immediately felt the heat through his boots and gloves. The metal was hot enough to cause serious burns, and the smoke made his eyes water and his throat burn. But the .50 caliber machine gun was intact, its massive bulk pointed directly at the advancing German infantry. Murphy checked the ammunition feed, a belt of shells that seemed to stretch forever, each round as thick as his thumb and capable of punching through steel plate at 1,000 yards. From his elevated position atop the burning tank destroyer, Murphy could see the entire battlefield with perfect clarity. The German attack was even larger than he had initially realized, not just the 250 infantry soldiers that intelligence had estimated, but closer to 300 men supported by 6 tanks and multiple self-propelled guns. They advanced in waves, using classic German tactics that had proven effective from Poland to the gates of Moscow. But those tactics had been developed for an army that could afford to take casualties. And Germany in January 1945 could no longer afford anything. Murphy opened fire with the .50 caliber machine gun, and the sound was like the world ending. The big rounds struck the advancing German infantry with devastating effect, each bullet carrying enough kinetic energy to stop a charging horse. Murphy had trained on the .50 caliber in basic training, but using it in combat was an entirely different experience. The weapon bucked and roared in his hands, spent brass casings flying through the air in glittering arcs. The muzzle flash creating a strobe light effect that illuminated the battlefield in stark, frozen moments. The German infantry, caught in the open with no effective cover, began to falter. Men fell by the dozen, cut down by Murphy's deadly accurate fire before they could close to effective rifle range. The survivors went to ground, seeking whatever shelter they could find in the snow-covered terrain. But Murphy's elevated position gave him clear fields of fire in every direction. He traversed the machine gun slowly and methodically, picking off enemy soldiers with the cold precision of a clockmaker, adjusting springs and gears. But Murphy's position, while tactically superior, was also supremely dangerous. The burning tank destroyer beneath him was loaded with high-explosive shells that could detonate at any moment, and the heat from the fire was beginning to affect the metal of the machine gun itself. Worse, German artillery had begun to zero in on his position. The first ranging shots, landing dangerously close and sending fountains of earth and snow high into the air. A German tank shell struck the ground just 10 yards from Murphy's position, the explosion lifting him partially off his feet and showering him with debris. Shrapnel from the shell tore through his left leg, but the wound was superficial, painful, but not disabling. Murphy barely noticed the injury. His entire consciousness focused on the rhythm of the machine gun and the deadly mathematics of intersecting fields of fire. He had transcended individual survival now and become something larger, a focal point of American resistance. A single soldier holding back an entire German assault through nothing more than skill, courage, and an inexhaustible supply of .50 caliber ammunition. The Germans, for their part, could not understand what they were facing. Their intelligence had told them that American soldiers were soft, products of an industrial society that had made them dependent on comfort and luxury. They expected token resistance followed by rapid collapse once the American soldiers realized they were outnumbered. What they encountered instead was a nightmare scenario, a single enemy soldier who seemed immune to fear, who fired with mechanical precision, who could not be suppressed or intimidated or driven from his position despite every tactical advantage being in German favor. German squad leaders screamed orders that were lost in the chaos of battle. Individual soldiers attempted to flank Murphy's position, only to be cut down by his devastating fire before they could get within effective range. Tank commanders tried to get clear shots at the American lieutenant, but the burning tank destroyer provided just enough cover to make precision fire difficult. And their own infantry was so intermixed with Murphy's field of fire that they risked hitting their own men. For 1 hour 60 minutes that stretched like an eternity, Murphy held his position atop the burning tank destroyer and single-handedly stopped a German attack that should have overwhelmed his company within minutes. He fired over 600 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, the machine gun growing so hot that paint began to peel from its barrel and the metal itself began to glow. The tank destroyer beneath him creaked and groaned as fire consumed its interior, the temperature rising to levels that should have been unsurvivable for any human being. German soldiers crept as close as 10 yards to Murphy's position, close enough to throw grenades or fire Panzerfausts at point-blank range. But Murphy's fire was so accurate and so deadly that none of them survived long enough to get off effective shots. Bodies began to pile up in the snow around the burning tank destroyer, German blood staining the white ground in patterns that spoke of Murphy's mechanical precision. Some of the dead were teenagers, conscripted in the final months of the war when Germany was scraping the bottom of its manpower barrel. Others were veterans, men who had survived years of combat on multiple fronts only to die in a frozen clearing in Alsace at the hands of a 19-year-old American farm boy who had never weighed more than 120 pounds. The psychology of the German attack began to shift as minutes turned into an hour. What had begun as a confident assault by superior numbers gradually transformed into something approaching horror as German soldiers realized they were being systematically destroyed by a single enemy soldier who seemed incapable of missing. Morale, already strained by months of retreating from American and Allied advances, began to crack under the pressure of Murphy's relentless fire. German officers attempted to rally their men for final desperate rushes, but the mathematics of the situation had become undeniable. Murphy commanded the high ground. He had unlimited ammunition, and his field of fire covered every approach route. Any German soldier who showed himself for more than a few seconds was cut down immediately. The attack began to lose momentum as soldiers went to ground and stayed there, unwilling to advance into certain death. Murphy himself existed in a state that transcended normal human consciousness. The heat from the burning tank destroyer had begun to affect his uniform, singeing his sleeves and making his helmet almost too hot to touch. The wound in his leg throbbed with each heartbeat, and his hands were beginning to blister from contact with the superheated machine gun. But none of these physical discomforts registered in his conscious mind. He had become pure function, a killing machine calibrated to the precise requirements of modern combat. The German attack finally broke when Murphy's concentrated fire destroyed the morale of the surviving infantry. Men who had fought across Europe began to pull back, first individually and then in groups, abandoning positions they had gained at terrible cost. The supporting German tanks, deprived of infantry support and unable to get clear shots at Murphy's position, began a fighting withdrawal toward the tree line. The battle was over, decided not by superior numbers or better equipment, but by the will of a single American soldier who had refused to yield an inch of ground. Murphy continued firing until his ammunition was exhausted, the machine gun's barrel glowing orange in the gray afternoon light. Only then did he climb down from the burning tank destroyer and make his way back to his company's positions in the woods. His men stared at him with expressions that mixed awe, disbelief, and something approaching religious reverence. They had just witnessed something that defied rational explanation. A single soldier holding off an entire German assault for over an hour. The immediate aftermath of the battle revealed the full scope of Murphy's achievement. German casualties exceeded 50 dead and wounded, a devastating toll for an attack force that could ill afford such losses. American casualties were minimal, a few wounded, no dead. The tactical implications were enormous. A German attack that should have succeeded easily had been repelled by superior American firepower and individual heroism, buying precious time for Allied forces to consolidate their positions and prepare for the next phase of the war. But the larger implications went far beyond tactical considerations. Murphy's stand at Holtzwihr represented something fundamental about American military culture in World War II, the belief that individual initiative and courage could overcome seemingly impossible odds. German military doctrine emphasized collective action, subordination of individual will to hierarchical command structures, and the supremacy of the state over personal conscience. American military culture, by contrast, celebrated the citizen soldier who could think independently, adapt to changing circumstances, and take initiative when circumstances demanded action. The K-ration, in this context, became more than just military ration. It represented the industrial and agricultural abundance that allowed America to field armies across multiple theaters simultaneously while maintaining living standards at home that exceeded anything available to enemy populations. German soldiers in early 1945 were fighting on reduced rations. Their equipment was increasingly composed of ersatz materials, and their supply lines were strained beyond the breaking point. American soldiers like Murphy carried enough food to sustain themselves indefinitely. Their equipment was manufactured to the highest standards, and their supply lines stretched back to an industrial base that seemed capable of unlimited production. Murphy's Medal of Honor citation, when it was finally written, could only hint at the full significance of what had happened in that frozen clearing near Holtzwihr. The official language, indomitable courage, refusal to give an inch of ground, single-handedly holding off a company of German soldiers, captured the tactical facts but missed the deeper meaning. What Murphy had demonstrated was not just individual heroism but the triumph of democratic values over totalitarian ideology. The German soldiers who attacked Murphy's position had been indoctrinated for years in the belief that Americans were racially inferior, morally decadent, and militarily incompetent. Nazi propaganda had portrayed American soldiers as pampered products of a soft civilization who would crumble at the first sign of serious resistance. What they encountered instead was a soldier who embodied the very best of American military tradition: self-reliant, innovative, deadly when threatened, and absolutely unwilling to surrender ground that had been paid for with American blood. In the weeks following the battle, Murphy's fame spread throughout the American forces in Europe. The story of the young lieutenant who had held off an entire German assault single-handedly became legend, repeated in mess halls and foxholes from Normandy to the Rhine. But Murphy himself remained uncomfortable with the attention, insisting that he had simply done his job and that any other American soldier would have acted the same way under similar circumstances. This modesty was itself characteristic of American military culture. Unlike German or Soviet systems that celebrated individual heroes as embodiments of state power, American military tradition emphasized the ordinary citizen who rose to extraordinary circumstances when duty demanded. Murphy was not a professional warrior or a product of elite military academies. He was a farm boy from Texas who had enlisted because his country needed him and who had discovered reserves of courage he never knew he possessed. The transformation of Murphy's legend from tactical victory to cultural symbol occurred gradually over the months following the battle. As word of his actions spread, Murphy came to represent something larger than individual heroism. He embodied the potential that existed within every American soldier. In a war where propaganda played an increasingly important role in maintaining morale, Murphy's story provided proof that American values could triumph over Nazi ideology even when the odds seemed impossible. German military analysts who studied the battle after the war reached conclusions that would have profound implications for post-war military doctrine. They recognized that American soldiers possessed qualities that German training had failed to develop: individual initiative, adaptability under stress, and the ability to continue fighting effectively even when cut off from higher command. These qualities, they concluded, were products not of military training but of cultural values that emphasized individual responsibility and democratic decision-making. The irony was that Hitler's ideology, which proclaimed the superiority of the Aryan race and the German military tradition, had been decisively refuted by a teenager from Texas who weighed barely over 100 pounds. Murphy's victory at Holtzwihr demonstrated that courage was not a racial characteristic but a human quality that could be found in any society that valued individual dignity and freedom. The Nazi concept of the master race crumbled when confronted with the reality of American democracy in action. Murphy's post-war life would be marked by the struggle to reconcile his wartime experiences with the expectations of peacetime society. The young man who had killed more enemy soldiers than any other American in World War II found himself uncomfortable with the role of national hero. He suffered from what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, experiencing nightmares, depression, and difficulty adjusting to civilian life. His struggles were shared by millions of American veterans who had witnessed the horrors of modern warfare and returned home to a society that expected them to resume normal lives as if nothing had changed. But Murphy's legacy extended far beyond his individual experiences. His story became part of the larger narrative of World War II as a conflict between competing ideologies: democracy versus totalitarianism, individual freedom versus state control, abundance versus scarcity. The Korashin that sustained Murphy during his hour on the burning tank destroyer represented not just military logistics but the fundamental difference between societies that trusted their citizens and those that feared them. In the decades following World War II, Murphy's story would be retold countless times in books, movies, and documentaries, each retelling emphasizing different aspects of his achievement. Some focused on the tactical brilliance of his actions, others on the individual courage required to stand alone against overwhelming odds. But the most enduring interpretations recognized that Murphy's victory represented something uniquely American: the belief that ordinary citizens, when called upon to defend their values, could achieve extraordinary things. The snow that fell on that January afternoon in 1945 has long since melted, and the forests around Holtzwihr have grown quiet again. The battlefield where Murphy made his stand is now peaceful farmland, marked only by a small monument that few tourists ever visit. But the memory of what happened there continues to resonate in American military culture, a reminder that individual courage can still make a difference in an age of industrial warfare and technological complexity. Murphy's hour atop the burning tank destroyer lasted only 60 minutes, but its significance extends across generations. In an era when warfare was increasingly dominated by massive forces and sophisticated weapons, one young American soldier demonstrated that human courage remained the decisive factor in combat. His victory was not just tactical but moral proof that the values for which America fought in World War II were worth defending, even at the cost of individual lives. Machine gun that Murphy fired that day was manufactured in an American factory by workers who never saw combat, but who understood that their labor contributed to the defense of freedom. The ammunition he expended was produced by the same industrial complex that turned out tanks, aircraft, and ships at a rate that amazed and terrified America's enemies. But the courage that Murphy displayed could not be manufactured or mass-produced. It came from sources deeper than industrial capacity or military training. As the sun set on January 26, 1945, and the snow continued to fall over the battlefield near Holtzwihr, Audie Murphy had become something more than a soldier. He had become a symbol of what America represented in World War II, not just military power or industrial capacity, but the fundamental belief that individual human beings, when fighting for principles they held dear, could overcome any force that tyranny could deploy against them. In a war that would ultimately be decided by massive armies and devastating weapons, the image that would endure was of one young man standing alone on a burning tank destroyer, holding back the darkness with nothing more than courage, skill, and an unshakable faith in the values he had sworn to defend. The K-ration boxes, scattered in the snow around Murphy's position, would be collected and redistributed to other American soldiers, their contents nourishing bodies that would continue the fight until victory was achieved. But the memory of what Murphy had accomplished would nourish something more important: the American spirit itself. The belief that democracy could prevail against any enemy and that freedom was worth any sacrifice. In 1 hour of combat in a forgotten corner of Alsace, a farm boy from Texas had written his name into the annals of American heroism and demonstrated that the American dream was more than mere rhetoric. It was a reality that could be defended by anyone with the courage to stand and fight.